Illinois report cards for 2025 reflect a new standard for student proficiency. And while this new standard is a step in the right direction, it lacks the proper context related to actual student performance across the state and nation. This video will provide an overview of the characteristics of the new benchmarks, as well as offer practical guidance to schools on how to best communicate student proficiency under the new benchmarks. It's important to recognize that student proficiency is a policy construct that evolves over time with changes to state policy. You're looking at a 20-year history of student proficiency in Illinois. And at first glance, you can see that there's been large changes to student proficiency rates over this period. But if we zoom in a little bit, what we'll find is that this corresponds perfectly with changes in state policy. From 2006 to 2012, that was the ISAT assessment and policies related to the ISAT. Student proficiency at that time was roughly 75%. Then in 2013, the Illinois State Board of Education changed the cut scores, and student achievement or student proficiency dropped considerably because the rigor of the benchmarks was increased. That happened again in 2015 with the introduction of PARCC that resulted in even more rigorous benchmarks and hence lower student proficiency rates. Student proficiency stayed stable through 2019. PARCC at that point was rebranded to IAR. We saw a little dip as it relates to COVID, but then we are starting to see a large increase in 2025 again. This is related to new IAR cut scores, which is the focus of this presentation. Most districts are going to see an increase in student proficiency when they compare 2025 to prior years, but it's important to understand that this does not reflect district or school performance, but rather a change in state policy. An important takeaway from that analysis is to recognize that proficiency is a policy construct that compares a student's academic achievement to a fixed aspirational standard, and that fixed aspirational standard is policy at the time students were administered a particular assessment. That is very different than this notion of being at grade level. And at grade level is an empirical construct that compares a student's academic achievement to what is typical at a particular grade level. Now, we often use these terms interchangeably, but we shouldn't. We have to recognize that proficiency is a distinct and separate construct from this notion of being at grade level, and that proficiency is a long-term aspirational policy standard, and at grade level is what is typical or atypical of similar students across the state or across the nation. Let's dive into the data and add a little bit more color to this conversation. So the first thing that you're going to see is that there is significant variation in rigor across grades and subjects as it relates to the new proficiency benchmarks. That ranges from the 45th national percentile to the 69th national percentile. This is important because the proficiency rates that are reported on the Illinois State Report Card reflect the rigor of these benchmarks. And at first glance, you'll see a few trends. One is you'll see that the math benchmarks are significantly more rigorous than the ELA benchmarks. And by rigorous, I mean the associated national percentile corresponding to that benchmark. And so if you were to look at math in grade 3, you'll notice that in order to be proficient, you have to score roughly at the 55th national percentile. But in grade 8, to be proficient, you have to score roughly at the 69th national percentile. That goes as low as grade 5 in ELA for the 45th national percentile. So you can start to see that using these benchmarks out of the box is going to be difficult because math shows a rigor increase as grade levels increase, and so it's going to be more and more difficult over time for a student to keep their proficiency because they will have to go from roughly the 55th national percentile in grade 3 to all the way to the 69th national percentile in grade 8. We'll see the opposite trend in ELA, where rigor, although to a lesser degree, decreases as grade levels increase. So you'll likely see proficiency rates increase as it relates to ELA student proficiency. That gap is widest in grade 8, where it is a 21 national percentile gap. So if you take that and think about that, it really indicates that in order to be proficient in math, you have to be far more competitive nationally than you do in ELA. This brings us to our second point, in that most districts will see a steady drop in math proficiency from grade 3 to grade 8 that is unrelated to student, school, or district performance. Remember, on a previous slide, we saw that the rigor of the math benchmarks increase from grade 3 to grade 8. Consequently, proficiency rates drop from 50% in grade 3 to 33% in grade 8, a 17% drop. This drop is not related to student, school, or district performance, but rather is an artifact of increasing the rigor of benchmarks from grade 3 to grade 8. The third characteristic to understand about the new proficiency benchmarks is that most districts will show significantly higher proficiency in ELA compared to math. You saw on a previous slide that the rigor of the math benchmarks is significantly higher than the rigor of the ELA benchmarks. If we look at the actual proficiency rates across Illinois based on the 2025 state report card, you can see that nearly all grades have a large proficiency gap. This gap is largest in grade 8 and grade 9, where there is a 24% proficiency gap between ELA and math. Again, this gap is likely unrelated to student, school, or district performance, but rather related to a gap in the rigor of the benchmarks. So given these complexities, how does ECRA recommend overcoming these challenges when communicating student success to your board or community? Let's look at a few things that you can do. So the first piece is to be careful not to interpret increases in 2025 student proficiency compared to prior years as any evidence of improvement. You saw on that first graph how policy changes radically influence proficiency rates. In 2025, the cut scores were changed with the idea to make them more reasonable and more right-sized as it relates to an appropriate standard for student performance. Nevertheless, the bar was lowered. And so just like a track and field event, if you ask students to jump over a lower bar, more students will jump over that. And so most districts in Illinois will see an increase in student proficiency rates in 2025 that is unrelated to school or district performance because the bar was lowered. The second piece is that you should not compare student proficiency between grades and subjects. This presentation should have demonstrated that the rigor of the proficiency benchmarks or cut scores is very different across grades and subjects. So to compare student performance across grades and subjects when they're asked to, the equivalent again of the track and field example, asked to jump over bars that are at various heights, makes a very difficult comparison to make. And so it is our recommendation not to compare raw proficiency across grades and subjects because you're comparing performance against benchmarks that are of varying rigor. And so those two things together, then how do we overcome that? So the first piece, the first way to overcome that is do not interpret proficiency in isolation. That if you're going to report proficiency rates, you have to report either a state or national percentile alongside the percent metric for context. Many of you will notice that you may see gaps in proficiency in one direction, but gaps in percentiles in the other. The only way to provide context to student performance is to put percentiles next to raw proficiency metrics. And this is that notion of separating what it means to be proficient to what it means to be at grade level. And so it's really important when you report proficiency to the board or the community that you contextualize that with appropriate percentiles. And then the fourth piece of guidance that we would offer is whenever you're evaluating district, school, or program performance, you really should be off the metric of student proficiency altogether, and you should really be looking at student growth. Student growth is by far the most meaningful metric for school improvement because it takes into account a baseline and then looks at progress from that baseline. So if you've instituted a new program or have a new curriculum or have a new school improvement initiative or a new strategic plan, you really want to look at, have you been able to accelerate rates of academic growth as a result of those investments or policy changes? That's going to be a much more scientific way to look at impact and ultimately answer the question of academic return on investment. For more information related to the new benchmarks or for resources that can help you communicate student proficiency under the new benchmarks to your board or community, visit eckergroup.com/new benchmarks.